Hello, this is Michael Fox, and I am a process nerd. I'm excited to share with you today some things about process management that maybe you didn't know before. Things that will help you to streamline operations, make more profit, make your employees and your customers happier, and to get things done better. So why don't we dive in and have a quick explore of that? So today we're going to go through some process modeling techniques. So there's two main notations that we can use for process modeling. They are BPMN, so that is Business Process Model Notation, and UPN, Universal Process Notation. There are multiple tools in market that allow us to model processes in these notations. I'm not going to go into details about all of those today. I might mention a few to get you started. One of which, when I start with BPMN, is free to use. You can download it or use it within your browser, not a problem. Yeah, we're going to go through that today. I'm hopefully going to be able to spend 40 minutes or so talking about this sort of stuff with you and some other techniques to go through. How to use a process model to the best of your advantage when you're improving the process. And yeah, so let's dive in. So we have two notations. The first one I'm going to talk about, because it's a little bit more technical one, is BPMN. BPMN 2.0, it is the second version of the notation. There are heaps of shapes that you can use to notate a process. And what you want to be able to do is, from start to end, get a clear picture about what is going on in the process. And there are several elements that we can use to help do that. To begin with, we have a start event, and that is a circle with a thin outline. You need to be able to say what the trigger is, and there's multiple types. So there's just a blank start event. Make sure you label it, but there's nothing inside the circle or anything like that. There's a timer, which has a little clock inside. That says that you've got a certain time that the process will kick off, or a certain period or a certain interval, right? So you might want to say every first Tuesday. At 10 o'clock in the morning, this process will run. And so at that time, the process will start and then it will go through. There are other conditional events. So when certain things become true within your system, then you will want the process to kick off. You'll just have to list out what those conditions are. And the other one that I use frequently is the signal event. It is an event that basically says that when something occurs within your system, when an item is created or when an item is updated, that the workflow will run. So what we want to be able to do is use whatever you think is best in the circumstance to kick off the process and make sure that you label it. So label it with the thing that needs to be happening for the process to start. Is people don't notate. The start event, we need to know what the trigger is, what starts the process, what would cause this process to begin. Make sure it's notated clearly, because there can be other ramifications around how we actually plan around system change and things like that that we need to know about. The more information, the better, and that's the purpose of the process model, is to be able to communicate that information clearly and directly. What we have then after that is a task. The tasks, usually every start event should be preceded by a task. That is typically the way it goes. I don't normally recommend a gateway straight after, which is a decision point. Because if the process is just starting, there's typically no information to use. However, if you're using a workflow or you're going to be dictating a workflow, it can be of use. Those of you who don't like gateways straight after start events, I'm sorry, but if you're reading out of an ERP system or something that runs BPMN, chances are there are going to be circumstances where you need to make a decision. If you're beginning out starting to model a process, you might want to just not use this because a process has inputs and outputs. Technically, a decision needs inputs to be able to be made. Therefore, if you're starting the process from the very beginning, you should not be using the gateway. But we'll get to gateways in a minute. So there are multiple different tasks you can dictate. The task types are just a blank task. There's a manual task, which has a little hand icon. There is a send and receive task, which has a little envelope of different colors or gradient to say what it is. There are service tasks and there are script tasks. Don't get too bogged down in these. The point of the task is really to say what's going on. You can use those types of other notations to differentiate between the different tasks if necessary. Later on, the main thing that we want to focus on right now is getting the information on the page, and we can make changes afterwards. So what you want to be able to do is you need to be able to name that task. The task needs a name. Do not leave no name in the task. We need to know what it is. We need to know what is happening. A task is when you are doing something. And so that means that we need to name that task in the verb noun format. That's right. I get a few glances every time I bring this up. We're going back to basic English, right? Grade 1 English. My daughter's just been learning about that last year. You need to know what a verb and a noun is, and you need to know that the verb is the doing word and the noun is the thing word. And when you're doing a task, you're doing something. It only needs to be 2 words, the verb and the noun. You can add another slight descriptor in there if you need to differentiate between different types of the noun. Let's say risk. You might want to say manage project risk versus manage operational risk if there is a clear distinction between what they are. So keep that in mind. Don't leave a story in the task box. Please, for the love of all that is holy, please do not leave a novel in the task box. All the other information that needs to be done is there is a separate shape for that. It is called the text annotation, and in many systems there is also an attributes window that can open up for the task where you can leave a description. You don't really need to leave it on the model. It takes up a lot of room if you're leaving a lot of descriptive information. And typically, you're going to be wanting to take that information and formulate up requirements and knowledge articles anyway. Keep it off the model. Keep it as neat and tidy as possible. It will help you pass your QA later on, and that information isn't lost if you keep it in other places that it's attached. Preference is to keep it within the model, but not on the model itself. So within attributes and things like that is definitely preferred. So you have your task, verb, noun format. Okay? So you might say determine the role requirement, and an output of that might be a job description. Okay, so once you have that, now you can do something else. Is there a meaningful job requirement here? No. Or then we don't need to continue with the process and you can use an end event, no job required. But if you do need the job to be required and there is enough sufficient need for the role, then you can say we need to advertise the role. Now you can go ahead and do another task, which is called, you guessed it, verb noun format as advertise role. You can go ahead and do that. Now before that, we've got that little decision point. And for that, we use a gateway. Now, gateways are in the form of a diamond, not a triangle, a diamond. And within that diamond, there are there's 4 different ones, but we won't cover the complex gateway today. There are 3 main ones that you will use. And a lot of business analysts don't like using all the different ones, but there is a clear distinction between what they are and the notation means something. So when I look at the notation, I can know what it means by what the decision diamond has within it. So we're going to go through 3 different circumstances here. Okay? The first one is the parallel gateway. So what the parallel gateway does is it's got a little plus inside of the diamond, and the plus is there because, that's right, it splits out, and both tasks, both paths that are after it take place. So the token splits out, and now the process is following 2 different paths at the same time. Now you'll need to remember to come back and resolve those paths later. You need to make sure that either it resolves at another gateway or those paths end of their own accord with an end event. Okay, we don't need unnecessary process loops open. We want to be able to make sure that they're all closed off. But that's what the parallel gateway there is for. You don't really need to label anything on the parallel gateway because it is, by virtue of being parallel, that all paths will be followed afterwards. You can, if it makes some things more clear, but it's not necessary. The second one is the exclusive gateway, and that is an X within the diamond. Only one of the following paths is followed. Only one. You don't need to follow multiple ones. It's only one, and here we need the outgoing sequence flows. Those are the arrows that come out of the side of the shapes. They need to be labeled with the conditions that need to be true for the process to follow that path, and only one will be followed. So that means that each of the conditions need to be mutually exclusive, and that's why it's called the exclusive gateway. The third one is the inclusive gateway, and that is a circle within the diamond. Now this one is a mixture between both. So one of the paths needs to be followed, one or more. And again, because one or more, there will need to be a description on each of the outgoing sequence flows to be able to label up what condition needs to be true for it to follow that path. So you might have a parallel gateway in a hiring process where both IT need to go up and set up a new employee in a system once they've been signed, and also the manager of the department needs to put together the onboarding material for their team. So those are two tasks that happen at the same time. An exclusive gateway will be, let's say the employee doesn't need to be set up in any systems. That means that IT doesn't need to be involved. So that means that there needs to be a predetermined thing about the type of that employee. Maybe they're a production employee on a manufacturing floor. They don't need access to systems. They just need to show up and work the production line. Therefore, IT do not need to be involved for this specific employee, and they don't need to set up them in system. So the process will not follow it in that case, but in other cases they will, okay? So now you're using an inclusive gateway because one or more paths will be used based on the conditions. And that is, in some cases, IT will set them up in the systems that need to be used. Does that make sense? Clear as mud. So now we have other elements on the process that we can use. So first of all, cover off the end event. The end event is when the process comes to a close. So that is a particular outcome has been reached. We have reached the objective of that particular path, and the end event is labeled with what we achieved. Maybe the employee has been onboarded. Maybe that is the point that the process has been completed, and you'll just put on the end event and you'll label it employee onboarded. It needs to be simple, and it needs to be easy to read and easy to understand. What you need to know about working with teams and working with people and the practice of writing itself is you need to be able to use the words that most people understand very quickly. So typically what I encourage people to do is to think about what it means to communicate to a 12-year-old. Yes, we're dealing with adults in a workplace, but the lower the comprehension level, the easier it is to read, the less energy it takes to read. And we want to be able to read as quickly and comprehend as quickly as possible. Could you use elaborate language? Absolutely, you could. Will it take longer to understand? You're damn right it will. Please keep your language simple. The other elements that are on the page are a pool and a lane. So what we need to look at is this. If you're looking at like a swimming pool, let's say you're watching the Olympics and you're looking at the top-down view of the swimming pool. You have the pool, which is the entire pool where all the water is. It's where all the work is done within your organization, and then you have each of the lanes for the swimmers, right? Think of each of those lanes as a separate role within your organization. Some processes will only have the pool with one lane. It's literally just the pool, just name it what it is. Many other processes, though, 98% of the processes I've modeled have more than one, will need to have the different lanes separated out. Now, a word of warning. Each lane needs to be labeled, and they need to be labeled at the same level of detail. Some processes, based on how big they are, how complex they are, you might have the division with different departments to state what each department does. The next level down will have each department with the different roles that are involved in completing the work. What we don't want to see is a combination of departments and roles on the same model. Again, it's about clarity, it's about how the work flows through, and we want to make sure that it is clearly articulated on the model. That's how lanes and pools work. All the work that you do within your organization should be within a pool and a lane. It shouldn't be sitting outside of a lane. Now, there are two types of pools. There's the collapsed and expanded. The expanded one is where the lanes live. It is the work that's done within the business. The collapsed ones are where external work happens. That is customers, suppliers, other external type of stakeholders that you don't have any control over. And this is what I usually state to people is, if you have control over the work being done, and there are people within the business that make decisions around that work being done. It's going to be within the expanded pool, within the lane. If you don't have control over how other people behave, it's going to be within the external pool. For example, you can't control the actions of a customer. You'll send them a form to do, they won't get back. You'll send them a form again. You'll follow up however they conduct their lives. You don't have control over that. All the process is showing is that you're sending a form to them and you're expecting to get one back. That's it. That's all it is. So there's no need to put on a task there for a customer to sign a form because it's not in your control. Make sure that you're labeling your things well and that you're using the correct element type to demonstrate what is happening within the process and who is involved in the process. Now, if you're using an object-based repository, something like a BIC, a Signavio, an ARIS, things like that, you will be able to run reports around the activities that different roles are doing. Think about the role of a HR manager. They're going to have tasks on their HR manager report on their role that are around managing the hiring and onboarding of employees and things like that. So they'll be able to list out the different tasks and things that are available to them and the systems that they are using. And that is constructed because those tasks are held within their lane on the model. A lot of these systems create these reports automatically based on how the models are constructed. So that's another important reason to be able to get this right, is it allows you to go back later and to be able to report on those things so you can communicate to your stakeholders. You can do change assessments, all those types of things. Super important for you to remain productive. And really, this is what makes analysts. You're a process analyst. You're not a process modeler. Any process analyst should be able to model processes in their sleep. It's how we use the information about those processes later where we really start to deliver value in these types of roles. So I'll have a think about that as we go. What information do I need to be effective as I model this process as an analyst to deliver as much value to my stakeholders in this project as possible? So 2 more elements that we need to cover off. The next one is the document type. So the document indicates the inputs and outputs of a specific task, and they are linked via their own association to a task with an arrow that feeds into the task or out of the task. And we have to make sure that we can't input a piece of information unless we've output it from another task prior to that. So just think about that as you're working through your inputs and outputs of each of your processes. You might do that through the form of a SIPOC or another type of method. You can use it for your templates. You can use it for other documents that are produced. Just make sure that you're labeling them and categorizing them correctly. The other one is the data store. And typically when you're dealing with an organization that's not using an executable sense, so BPMN being the executable notation, if they're not using the diagram for execution, there is no system element. So the data store usually gets relegated to being used for a notation around the system that is being used. So if I'm using Microsoft Outlook to do a task, let's say I'm drafting an email or I'm sending an email, I might be using a template, which is a document, and I might be using the system, which is Microsoft Outlook. You might dictate on the diagram that Microsoft Outlook is used as a data store element. And from a notation standpoint, that's fine. There's not a problem with that. The real purpose of the notation, though, of that particular element is around databases and how data is managed. So you might be referencing out to different databases within the task that's being executed, and you might have a look at, let's say, use the hiring process again. You'll have an employees table, and so you will be pulling from and writing data to that table. So you'll use the data store for that table and you'll link up the table. So if I'm going to be onboarding an employee, I will link the employees table. And that means that the data for that task is going to be written to that table. That is a little bit more technical. Typically, I will not be dealing with databases without the help of a developer or someone who understands the data structure. if you're in a more complicated project or it's more high profile, you'll be working with someone like a solution architect or something like that to develop that out. You may not even be involved in the database thing, and that's fine. It's not really your job to do that if you're non-technical. But it is helpful when you're writing up requirements and user stories around demonstrating and communicating what needs to be thought about as the system is built out. So definitely something to think about that. That, in a nutshell, are the main components of BPMN. We're going to take a quick break and then we're going to come back and talk about UPN, which is the Universal Process Notation. Talk to you soon. And we are back, UPN. So we've gone through BPMN, not talking about that anymore. We're going to talk now about UPN. So UPN is Universal Process Notation. There are two shapes. That's right. You heard me right. We've just gone through BPMN where there's many different types of shapes and subtypes of those shapes, all those sorts of things. UPN has two shapes. And it's super easy. Why I love UPN. Don't get me wrong. I love BPMN. BPMN is a fantastic notation. They've covered off a lot of bases. They have thought about how processes work really well, and from a technical standpoint, really helps you communicate very easily and quickly the more technical aspects of how a process might run. However, having done training in the past and trying to work through with teams not familiar with the notations and how to read process models, UPN is by far and away the more user-friendly notation from a business user perspective. So have a think about the notation that you're using within the business and the purpose that you're using it. You may not need BPMN. You may never implement a technical solution that requires the use of BPMN. If we're talking about business processes and we're only talking about business users with no further information around IT, you should absolutely consider using UPN for that purpose. And don't get me wrong, technical teams can use UPN as well. It's not overly restrictive, it's just that the shapes aren't there to help you detect. You have to be more descriptive with the language that you use. Just keep that in mind. UPN. So there's two shapes. The Y box is the first one. Now it is what it says on the tin. What is a Y box? It is why something is happening, or it's why something has occurred. It's that simple. So you'll use the Y box as a start event, and you'll use it as an end event. You'll use it to describe a trigger, and you'll use it to describe what you achieved within the process. It's as simple as that. You'll also use them between each what box, and I'm going to describe to you in a moment what that's going to look like. But what it really helps you understand and do is to know what the inputs and outputs of a process are at the stage of each individual task. So how do the inputs and outputs feed into each one? And what do we need to be thinking about with those inputs and outputs as we go through the process? How do we know that we've actually got what we need to achieve the outcome that the process is there for? So we have the Y box triggers in between dealing with inputs and outputs and dealing with the outcome of the process. Super easy, right? The what box really has, I'm going to take a lot of time on this one because there's a lot you can do with it, okay? Particularly with the systems I've used. So the what box, it is what it says on the tin, okay? What is happening? It is the equivalent of a task within BPMN. It is telling us what activity is occurring. And you should be using the verb noun format that we discussed earlier. Verb noun, because you're doing something. And then there are subcomponents to the what box. The first one that we need to look at is the role. Within BPMN, remember what we talked about with the lanes? It's the role that's undertaking the activity. In this one, we don't deal with lanes. We're simply just dealing with elements on a page, right? There are no lanes. There is the what box, and it will list out the role in what capacity that role is involved with. So that leads us into a little tangential discussion we're going to have now around the RACI chart. RACI is a framework that tells us how different people are involved in doing work. And if you've ever been involved in a project environment, you've probably had someone at some point refer to building a RACI chart. And I have to tell you that building a RACI chart without the use of a process model is a goddamn nightmare. And don't do it. It is so much harder. You will spend so much time interviewing people around their responsibilities when you could literally just focus on the process. It is literally worthwhile buying a license to a tool for a short period of time to save you that time. Seriously, I'm not joking. Because as an analyst, you're paid good money to do what you do, right? And if you're doing it without a tool, it can be incredibly difficult and time-consuming to do it. Think about that as you go. If you're not using a tool, it's definitely worth getting one to extract that information and consolidate that information. Going back to the RACI, RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, Informed. Now, there are different nuances to this. Some other frameworks include an S, which is for support. I try not to overthink it too much. Pick one and run with it. You can educate your stakeholders around it later on if you're going to change it. But the key ones, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. Now, responsible is the person or the role doing the task. Who's doing the job? That is the responsible person. Every task needs to have a responsible role. Every task. We're talking about business users. Every task needs to have a responsible person. The second one is accountable. Now, I don't typically use the accountable element or the state on a task. And that is because typically we deal with accountability at a process level. The process level is the person who manages the entire process, but may not necessarily be involved in doing things within the process. They're the people that the board comes to answer for the performance, right? So those are the people that are accountable. Now, if you're in a very unstructured organization that might not be process-centric, you will have multiple accountable people within the process. Where in it will make sense to list the role of who is accountable for that specific task. So you're going to have an R and you're going to have an A on those tasks. The third one is consulted. So these are people who are involved on the task, but they may not necessarily be responsible for actually completing the task. And the way I think about this is about communication. It is a communicative relationship. Consulted capacity, it is a two-way communication. What do you think about this? I think this about this. I'm sending you a form that I expect to have back. I'm sending you the form back. I'm conducting a meeting and all these stakeholders are involved that meeting. I'm responsible for running the meeting and you are all consulted because I need your input. That is consulted, okay? When you think about it in terms of communication channels, it's much easier to determine which one you need to be putting on there. The other one is informed. So that's the I for informed. And that is where the communication channel is one directional. Okay? I've just ordered a new modem. I changed my internet provider. My old one really let me down recently with some tower issues. And I've decided to change. They, as part of their onboarding process, have sent me a modem. Now, when I have a task on there to say send modem as part of the onboarding process, I am informing the customer with a modem and the instructions on installation. I don't expect anything back from the customer. So I put the customer as informed on that task. So really super simple when you think about how the communication is running within that task. The other part of the what box is the system. So like we use the data store within BPMN sometimes to dictate what system we're using. So we do in UPN with the listing the system. And that's super simple. Just tell us what platforms and things you're using when you're doing the task. Really simple. So now we have this information on the page. Now in the systems that I've used, you're also able to add other attributes to these boxes. One of which I'll say you can use as forms or documents, which is super helpful if you're producing a letter or something and you want to show the letter that's being sent. Then you can put the letter on the what box to say that you're using that document. Now, why is that helpful? This is really helpful now when we go to run the reports. Before I told you about the hiring manager running a report on their role and seeing the tasks that they use. Now we can run our report. We can see not only what tasks they do and what they're involved in, we can see the capacity they're involved in, right? So maybe they're not just responsible on some tasks. Maybe they're consulted on other tasks. Maybe they are informed on other tasks. Maybe they're accountable for some. So, I can see what capacity they are on every single one. I can see what systems they need to be competent in. Are you really good in Microsoft Outlook? Do you know how to use Seek.com? Do you know how to use whatever it is? I need you to be able to be competent in this, and if I'm hiring you into the job and you're not competent on it, I need to make sure that you provide training on that system so that you become competent in it, because it's a requirement of the role. And the third one, the documents that role has access to, that's just helpful from a impact assessment standpoint. So we've talked about both notations now, and now we're going to have a quick discussion around that impact assessment. With the impact assessment, you want to be able to know who's affected by what change. So we're dealing with a current state, we're dealing with a future state. Now we've got two models on our hands. How are we actually going to manage this information? We go through what the differences are. We list out who is impacted by whatever potential change there is, what documents might need to be looked at, what systems might be able to be looked at, things like that. Now, if you're doing this in a process management system, this impact assessment can be done in half an hour. Yes, half an hour. I've worked with change analysts who don't have access to these systems. They will take 2 weeks or more to complete an impact assessment, which is insane, because change analysts are not paid a small amount to do what they do. They are an expensive resource, and for them to spend 2 or more weeks on, let's say you're billing, they're charging a daily rate of $1,000 a day. It's $10,000 you just spent on an impact assessment if they've taken 2 weeks. That's a lot. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to put this process information together in a way that's easy to consume, and in a way that the change analyst is able to really quickly get an understanding of the impacts to process change. Super cool, right? Yeah. All right. The next one is we need to think about what process change benefits there might be. So we've modeled the process, right? At the moment, it doesn't really matter what notations you've used. This is going to be applicable. So we want to be able to, as process analysts, we need to be able to understand how the process works and what goes into making the process. So what does that mean? We need to be able to know how long the process and each part of the process takes. We need to know about waiting times, and we need to know about how long each task takes. This will give us an understanding around bottlenecks so we can help streamline it, but also help us understand the impact of different changes and their benefits. And this is really super helpful, right? Don't underestimate this. If you can clearly articulate the benefits of any change, you can convince pretty much any executive of what a good change is versus a bad change. Any leader, when you're talking about what a process change might be, you're able to very clearly articulate this because you understand what the process is and how it runs. The next one is the volume. So how many cases are running through this process every day, every year? I typically go on a yearly thing. When I'm talking about benefits, I'm usually talking within a 12-month horizon. Once we implement this change across 12 months, how much benefit is it going to have to the business? Definitely good to think about that. So we're dealing with cycle time, we're dealing with volume. Now there's a missing piece. Can you tell me what it is? If a task is taking a specific amount of time and we want to know how much it costs, then we need to know the person who is doing it, what their rate is. So we look at the process model, we see who's responsible for doing the task, and guess what? We pull down whatever industry average there is for that role type. And we're able to quickly articulate a guesstimate on the cost of that task. Now, if you have a before and an after, say a current state and a future state, and that future state is running faster, I can subtract the future state from the current state algorithm, which is volume multiplied by rate multiplied by task time. Take that from the current state, and you end up with a financial figure as a benefit. How easy is that? You only need a few data points, and all of a sudden, I have a 12-month horizon I can communicate to a leader on a business case. Amazing, right? Now I have that information. What can I do? Now I know at a glance whether or not it will be worth chasing, okay, I can put into place some rules around what's actually going to be like. If it's under a certain amount, am I even going to look at it? So start looking at your own process for managing process, particularly around change, right? How little are we going to accept in way of returns when it comes to throughput? Is it 5,000 a year? Is it 15,000? Is it 100,000 a year? Are we not even considering anything under a certain amount? That will help you eliminate things. The second part of that is, now that I know the value of the return, now I know how much we can spend on a solution. And you might have some other rules around what you expect return on investment to be, and that is in percentages. So something that I've worked with customers in the past is that I usually don't put anything in front of them that's less than 30% ROI. Now that's a brilliant return. If you told me that I was going to get 30% ROI on the stock market this coming year, I'd be like, where do I sign up? So with a business improvement, you really want to be able to clearly articulate what the ROI is going to be. You don't know what that is unless you know what the benefit is. And you don't know what that is unless you know what the change options are. So it's really important that you be able to get that and be able to articulate that once you have that. It's really easy to put that on a one-pager, to go to an executive or a leader or a board, to be able to go, here's a change idea that we've had. We think that we can implement it like this, and we think that we can get a return on investment on this. Now put yourself in their shoes. What does it look like to them? Looks pretty goddamn good, right? You are putting information from them where they are able to clearly make a decision about whether to do something or not. And they can either give you a yes, a no, or a not yet. And then you're very clear about what their directions are. Other things that you're going to want to know about along this journey is understanding what the business strategy is. And if you can clearly articulate not just the benefits, the costs, the ROI, all of those sorts of things, but you're able to align it with the business objectives that those leaders have set in place during their planning and what they're trying to execute on, you are going to prove yourself a very valuable resource to them, because you're on the same page about what needs to be achieved and what types of returns they want to be seeing. Isn't that incredible? So that's it for today. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, input@processnerd.io. Would love to hear more from you, and please connect with me on LinkedIn. I have a newsletter that I'm now running. You're going to get that in your inbox a couple of times a week. You can find that at processnerd.io. You can sign up there directly, and it would be great to be able to communicate with you more around how we can make processes much better within your business. My name is Mike Fox. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks.